What do we need in order to experience nature, wildlife, the outdoors? This next clip is from Sri Lanka in 2013. Would this be considered a top-notch wildlife experience? Those are sperm whales in the back. Given that so much of a measure of our lives nowadays is on Facebook and Instagram, would this be an experience worth plastering all over social media? Perhaps. And yet, you're the first audience that I've chosen to share it with. When that whale dived, a friend of mine took this photograph, and that's me up there in the top right corner. And this is what I was experiencing. Amazing, without a doubt. But what about this interaction? So ignoring the location, the species of the animal involved, is there any less pleasure to be derived from this interaction from the previous one that you saw? Many would say, yes. Sure, this dialogue began over food, but now this crow visits my dad every day. It vocalizes differently based on its mood. It sits on his desk and watches and displays a curiosity and an interactiveness that is as comparable to that sperm whale. There are a couple of things I find amusing and very alarming about the way our generation interacts with the outdoors. One of them is the way we measure our experiences and assign value to what is worth our attention. Earlier this year, I was walking along the beach on Neil Island, and I came upon a group of people who had just finished their first ever dive in the sea. And one of them was berating the dive master for wasting time taking photographs of coral and fish. And the dive master was trying to explain to that man that these photographs are for you to remember your dive by and all the amazing things that you saw. And this man's response was, I can download all of these photos of coral and fish off of Google. You should have been taking photographs of me for Facebook. The second aspect of our interaction with the outdoors that I find interesting is the way we have come to define nature. In an exceptionally superlative-driven vocabulary, if we define nature as something untouched by man, it sets a very dangerous precedent. It suggests that in a world where we have so significantly altered the atmosphere, the oceans, the soil, there really is no nature then left. It also creates this notion that the more remotely we travel, the larger the animal we interact with, the more unique our time spent outdoors is, the more valuable the experience is. So let's put these two things together. We view the outdoors through the lens of our social media feeds. We assign value based on the latest trends and hype and all the noise around them. And in doing so, we seek out experiences which we're only able to make a reality in 2 or 3 weeks in the year, and the rest of it is just the happenings of life. Now, on top of all of this, we are bombarded by images of a dying ocean, climate change, a planet with an ever-increasing population such that we're bursting at the seams. Now, if I was to succumb to all of this, and I know how hard it can be not to, I end up with a very unrealistic worldview of the outdoors, of nature. And I end up with a very helpless feeling towards the trajectory that our environment is taking. Now, surely there is more to this. More than just 2 or 3 weeks in the year where we tick off a place on the top of a bucket list and take a whole bunch of photographs. To me, that is a very sad and disconnected way of interacting with an astonishingly cool planet. So how do we change this? Now, I'm not talking about change on the level of human beings living sustainably on planet Earth. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a smaller, individual change, one that will allow us to reclaim our relationship with the outdoors, and thereby our relationship with ourselves. I'm simply talking about changing the way that we see. So take these shield bugs, for example. I saw them as a little dot on a wooden column on a friend's veranda. And putting a macro lens on my camera, I managed to get this photograph. And in looking at this photograph, I started to wonder, why are these bugs still hanging around? They've hatched, there's no relationship to be fostered over here, and so why are they still clustered around their seemingly useless, discarded egg cases? In doing a little bit of a search on the internet, I found that female insects will sometimes leave behind a secretion or an excretion, and when the offspring eat this, they are introducing to their digestive systems a vital bacteria that they are not born with. Now, to me, that is amazing on so many different levels. Aside from the beauty of the creatures themselves, the mechanism of transferring this bacteria from an adult insect to its offspring that it never meets, the instinctual knowing of these creatures that they have to eat this yellow goop that you see over there before they head off into the world. To me, this stuff gives me goosebumps, both from a sense of being completely grossed out, but also completely fascinated. In her book, The Natural and Cultural History of Mosses, this lady, Robin Keema, she refers to human beings as poor myopic creatures with neither the raptor's acuity for long distance nor the talents of the housefly for panoramic vision. She says, we think we are seeing when we've only scratched the surface. Our acuity at this middle scale seems diminished, not by the failing of the eyes, but by the willingness of the mind. Now, my investigation into those shield bugs began with seeing something that I didn't recognize, and curiosity took over. I wanted to know. That wanting to know is a choice that each of us is in a position to make. And if you watch a child in a garden, more often than not, you will see that choice in action. Unfortunately, for many of us sitting over here, to exercise that choice in today's world means blocking out a whole lot of noise, unlearning so many things that are forced upon us, such that we can listen to a little voice, something that tells us to stop and take a second look when everything else is just rushing by. Now, I spend a lot of time exploring marine environments. So let's go there for a while. Newly certified divers, they tend to observe the most obvious, the larger fish on the reef. And so if you're in the Lakshadweep or the Andaman Islands, then it's the groupers, maybe the barracuda, sometimes a turtle, and if you're lucky, then a shark. Now, these are the things that have been pointed out to them when they were learning how to dive. When these divers get more control over themselves in the water, a whole nother world opens up to them. And yet, I have so often seen a dive be nothing more than 50 minutes of chugging along from one group of large and noticeable fish to the next group of large and noticeable fish. I call these people big fish divers, and they are instantly recognizable because underwater, they're staring off into the blue, anticipating something wow emerging from that middle distance, that they miss everything that is right underneath their noses. So what happens when you bring divers into a world where these are the states of our reef? What happens when all the sharks have been fished out and there are none to see on the reef? What happens when we are bombarded by this or this and told that these are the experiences to aspire to? Do we then become disappointed? Do we then spend time, money, and effort seeking out these magnificent experiences, have them, and then dismiss the less spectacular experiences that might follow? The danger with seeking these superlatives, coupled with the fact that our environment is degrading, is that we very often end up, in this case, on a reef like this, expecting that. And then in disappointment, we say things like, oh, you should have seen this place 5 years ago. Or, oh, we dived there yesterday, and actually there's really not that much to see. I took this next photo on a sand flat where most people wouldn't bother to dive. After all, what can there be to see on sand? Now, this is a hermit crab. And hermit crabs appropriate discarded snail shells, which they then wear on their backs. Now, in this sandy space, this rock becomes something for this feather star animal to cling to. Now, the hermit crab doesn't mind, because the feather star adds some style and credibility to his camouflage. And the feather star, which is a fairly sedentary animal, gets to piggyback along this sandy ocean floor. If I were to go even closer and look at the fronds of that feather star, I might find a commensal shrimp, or in this case, a squat lobster living within that feather star, probably completely oblivious of the hermit crab taxi service. There is always something to see. How we experience a place is very largely dependent on how we choose to look at that space. And to make a complaint that something isn't the way it was 5 years ago is to deny the existence of change. But so much worse than that is that it doesn't allow us to do justice to that place in the here and now. This is another crab that uses a slightly different strategy. It picks up this seaweed called Halimeda and fixes it to its exoskeleton, and then it hangs out next to an actual clump of Halimeda to complete its camouflage. Now, this photograph was taken on a very, very degraded reef system that I used to dive 4 or 5 times a week over a span of about 5 years. And it was only on one of my last dives that I ended up discovering this guy and taking a photograph of him. What most people would have found a mind-numbingly boring reef had become my backyard. There is an inexplicable pleasure in getting to know a space, getting so familiar with it, and observing the life within it. And you will start to see that even creatures like fish or lizards or birds can be individually idiosyncratic. They can also be creatures of habit. So the cuckoo that sits in the same branch on the same tree in your garden to watch the world from every day. The lionfish that inhabits the same patch of reef year upon year, such that he becomes so comfortable that he starts to follow the divers around. Even your own dog and the way he selects his patch of sunlight in the garden. This is a photograph of an ant. Completely unremarkable, not popular, sexy, cool, no. This fellow spent a little bit of time trying to disentangle the spider web that was attached to the back of his foot. And I spent that time staring at him through a magnifying lens. Now, ants are everywhere, and yet they are overlooked, underrated, incredible creatures. Similar to mankind, ants have learned to farm other creatures to their benefit, in this case aphids. They build incredibly complex nests with ventilation, temperature control, compost pits, burial chambers, food storage units. They interact with and affect their environment so exceptionally significantly. And these are just ants. Even Baloo the bear says, if you look under the rocks and plants and take a glance at the fancy ants. And swishing his bottom, he assures us that the bare necessities of life will come to you. When you stop and look at that level, something wonderful starts to happen. You start to make connections. You start to see silent conversations and relationships. And in doing so, a jigsaw puzzle starts to come together when otherwise it is just a scattering of pieces. And I assure you, spend enough time trying to put that puzzle together, and you will find your place in it. I've spent 20 years inhabiting this space, and I have come to be in complete awe of the marine system. And do you know why? It is not because of the blue whales or the manta rays or the big animals with big teeth. It is actually the fact that all of these creatures are nurtured by the secrets that just boring old seawater holds. This is a photograph of plankton under a microscope, collected from about that much seawater. If it were not for the this microscopic universe, and if it were not for the simple physical and chemical properties of water, all that other magnificent stuff that I was showing you would cease to exist. I chose the ocean as my backyard, but it didn't start with photographing the largest or the rarest or the most cool. No. It started with falling in love with that watery space. Now, many of you may choose the mountains, the forests. You may choose urban gardens. You may choose the little patch of green adjacent to your house. Whatever the space may be, make that choice. Stop and stare. And don't worry about the people that laugh at you for doing so. Because after all, no matter who you are the architects of the future. And the decisions that you make will be creating ripples, affecting lives, changing policy. The generation that comes next, the youngsters that you end up leading and teaching, they're going to have an even harder time drowning out that noise in order to listen to the little voice. Their jigsaw puzzles are going to be even more scattered. And in order for them to find their place in it, they're going to require a hell of a lot of help and encouragement from us. So if there's one thing that I ask you to do different in 2017, it is this. Seek out the mundane. Get curious about it. Fall in love with it. And I assure you, it will be spectacular. Thank you very much.